I flew from Canada to France in less than an hour? How does that work? Well, just off the coast of Newfoundland is a small French overseas collectivity called Saint Pierre and Miquelon. Despite being just 20 kilometers or so from Canada, these islands are very much a part of France and are home to roughly 6,000 people. The only way to get there by air is with Air Saint-Pierre, a small French airline that connects the islands with the outside world. So, after flying across Canada on only Dash 8s, obviously the most sensible choice was to immediately fly on another turboprop. With that, good morning from St. John's International Airport. This is the busiest airport in Newfoundland and Labrador and sees service from most major Canadian airlines. It's also a hub for PAL Airlines, which I tried to work into the Dash 8 trip, but just wasn't able to. As far as international carriers go, Air Saint-Pierre is pretty much it, and shares a check-in desk with Porter. Air Saint-Pierre serves the collectivity with flights to St. John's, Halifax, Montreal, and a few seasonal destinations. They also operate some inter-island flights too, and they even charter a 737 for seasonal flights to Paris. As you'd expect though, they only have two planes in the fleet, a single ATR 42-600 for the flights to Canada, and a Ream Cessna F-406 for inter-island and medevac flights. Following the Dash 8 trip, I needed to get myself from St. John's to Halifax, and while looking at options, discovered I could actually do that with an overnight in Saint Pierre. So that's exactly what I did. Besides, who wouldn't want to fly a domestic route through another country? The novelty of this meant I just had to do it. The ATR 42-600 taking us to Saint Pierre is a very new one, and registered as Foxtrot Oscar Romeo Lima Bravo. It joined Air Saint-Pierre in late 2020, replacing an older ATR 42-500. Funny enough, the first time I heard of Saint Pierre and Miquelon was seeing that older ATR in Montreal back in 2017. Since then, it's been a point of personal curiosity for me, and I've really wanted to visit. I knew just one night wasn't going to be enough to see everything, but it would still be a fun side trip going someplace completely new. Before that could happen though, I got a teensy bit concerned that they were heading to a completely different gate than we were told. As it turns out, St. John's doesn't really have a swing gate for the commuter flights, so they arrive on the international end of the airport and then taxi back over to the domestic side for the departure. Once our plane taxied back over, boarding started pretty informally without any announcements, so good thing I was nearby. Let's go check out Air Saint-Pierre. My seat for today is 3D right at the front, which had an excellent view out the window. This is actually my first time ever on an ATR, and the legroom is about as expected. Today's flight to Saint Pierre would only take 45 minutes or so it's not too bad. Pretty soon we were already starting up, and here's the departure from St. John's off of runway 29.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Captain Mr. Redman and his crew, we would like to welcome you aboard flight 1127, departing for Saint Pierre. Our flying time will be 45 minutes at an altitude of 20,000 feet.
Like I said before, our flight to Saint Pierre today would only take about 45 minutes, covering a total distance of 275 kilometers. I'm still not over the idea of flying westbound from a Canadian city to reach France. But now that we're airborne, heading to France on a turboprop, let's take a look around the ATR. I lucked out with a free aisle seat, so I had plenty of extra space. Up at the top is some extra storage that I guess could be used as a tablet holder. Below that is the tray table that slides out, but rests a bit low for my knees. It's worth mentioning that Air Saint-Pierre is one of those airlines that doesn't quite do online check-in, so if you want a window seat on the ATR, it's best to line up early. Shortly after takeoff, our cabin crew member came around with a bottle of water and cups for everyone. That was the extent of the service, but given the length of the flight, it seemed fair. In the seat back pocket, you'll also find the safety card for the ATR 42-600, and an air sickness bag. Other than that, the cabin looks very bright and clean, and I gotta say, this plane is actually really quiet. Surprisingly, much more so than the Dash 8, as unpatriotic as that sounds. We had some amazing views below as we followed Newfoundland's southern coast. On that note, Saint Pierre and Miquelon don't follow Newfoundland's half-hour offset time zone, and are actually half an hour ahead. That makes it technically the first place in North America, outside of Greenland, to celebrate New Year's. This place just has so many interesting quirks to talk about, and I could not be more excited to finally go see it for myself. The views below only got even better as we got closer, so here's the arrival into Saint Pierre, landing on runway 26.
Bienvenue à Saint-Pierre. Nous vous recommandons de prendre garde.
Arriving in Saint Pierre and Miquelon, you are obviously entering France, and so that meant going through customs and getting probably one of the most unique stamps I'll ever get on my passport. At one point, Canadians were supposedly able to enter with just a driver's license, but I wasn't sure if that was still the case, so it was better to be safe than sorry. Now, whenever I'm planning a trip, I try to avoid looking at Google Street View, which Saint Pierre does have, by the way, unless I'm looking for something specific. So, needless to say, I was genuinely surprised to get outside and find actual French cars. Let's not forget that we're just 25 kilometers away from the nearest Canadian town, and you just don't see French cars in Canada or the US. I was not expecting that at all. Here at Saint Pierre Airport, Air Saint-Pierre naturally has their maintenance base in a fairly large hangar. Funny enough though, I could see that their ATR 42-500 was still in there, but clearly in the process of being sold. In addition to that, Saint Pierre Airport also has a control tower, which, according to the Canada Flight Supplement, only operates for about 10 hours each day, and even less on Sundays. Granted, the airport itself is not that busy, and Air Saint-Pierre is the only scheduled airline with maybe 2 or 3 flights a day. In addition to the occasional general aviation aircraft or visit from the Canadian Coast Guard, ASL Airlines France flies in with a 737-700 during the summer months. They operate once weekly non-stop flights to Paris on behalf of Air Saint-Pierre. Given there's only a 5,900-foot runway here, that definitely has to be fun to watch. I would have loved to do some plane spotting here, especially with these amazing views. As it happens though, both my inbound and outbound flights were the only 2 taking place while I was here, so I'd say that's a good reason to come back. From the airport, it was only 2 kilometers or so to my hotel, so I ended up walking there, and it was well worth it just to stop and take in the view. Saint Pierre is the capital of Saint Pierre and Miquelon, and is the larger of the 2 municipalities. As you can see, I lucked out with the weather and got to see everything in some gorgeous August evening sunlight. Now you might notice that quite runway-shaped bit of pavement below, and as it happens, the airport I just landed at was not the original one serving Saint Pierre. That one opened in 1999, and replaced this original one, which opened in 1965. A good portion of the runway still exists, even as most of the site has been redeveloped. I'll take a closer look there, and at the old terminal building a little later tonight. I eventually found my hotel, which was a pretty new one along the water, also on the site of the old airport. It certainly felt very European, and that was made even more clear by the European power outlets. Again, so wild to see while I still have a single bar of reception from Canada. This hotel also had a restaurant, which I was soon told would be the only one open on the island since it was a Sunday evening. Needless to say, I made sure to get myself a reservation for later tonight. So, with a couple hours before sunset, I went to explore downtown Saint Pierre. The atmosphere here is undeniably European, and it is quite a contrast to what I'm used to on this side of the ocean. There's a ton of history here too. The islands were first visited by Europeans in the 1500s, and were settled by the late 1600s. Over the next few centuries, the islands traded hands, often violently, between the French and British multiple times, until 1816 when they permanently became a French territory. Saint Pierre and Miquelon is now the last remaining part of what was New France. Traditionally, the island's economies have been supported by a large fishing industry, but overfishing and territorial disputes with the Canadian government have since caused an economic decline. Subsidized by France, the islands are now looking to diversify through tourism and the exploration of oil and gas deposits. Today, in addition to the airport, Saint Pierre can be accessed by a seasonal ferry that runs to the town of Fortune in Newfoundland. Fortune is a town of only 1,200 people though, and from there, it's almost a 4-hour drive to St. John's, so you can see why the airport is crucial for medevac flights. Cars in Saint Pierre all have French license plates, and thanks to that ferry, it is possible to see these in some parts of Atlantic Canada. Also, interestingly, the only sign of any Canadian influence here was the hardware stores. I definitely did not expect to see a home hardware here of all places, but it makes sense that Canadian construction materials would be much easier to get here than European ones. Back on the other side of the harbor, I kept walking and found myself on the old Saint Pierre airport runway, which in itself is kind of odd. You wouldn't think an island with 5,000 people would need a brand new airport. However, while the new airport has 5,900 feet of runway, the old one only had 4,100 feet, and you can see it was a bit constrained. With the extra space, that new airport was able to handle 737s, and the first flight to Paris took place in 2018. While most of the runway has been redeveloped at this point, the old terminal and, presumably, the old Air Saint-Pierre hangar still stand. Near there was this rocky beach. The closest Canadian islands were just out of sight from here, but it was a great view nonetheless. Honestly, I'm so glad I came here. It was such a treat to be able to explore this unique piece of France that's right in my own backyard, relatively speaking. With that, it was back to the hotel, where I had a really nice beef cheek dish for dinner. One thing I was looking forward to the whole time was the food, and safe to say, it did not disappoint. Breakfast the next morning was just as good, if not even better, with freshly baked croissants and some jam from Miquelon. The weather outside was still gorgeous, and with this amazing sunrise, it was time to say goodbye to Saint Pierre. I think the one-night stopover was a great way to experience Saint Pierre for the first time, but I definitely want to come back and stay for longer. It's not just the novelty of having a piece of Europe in North America, but the fact that it's a genuinely gorgeous place to visit. Besides, if there's one thing Saint Pierre Airport needs, it's a plane spotting compilation that absolutely nobody asked for. Back at the terminal, the departure process was pretty straightforward. Before I left my hotel, I was told there wasn't any point in getting to the airport more than an hour before takeoff, since there just wouldn't be anybody at the desks, and that was definitely a good call. On that note, pretty much everyone I interacted with spoke English, which was probably for the best that I didn't have to inflict my middle school level French on anyone. Like I said on the flight here, Air Saint-Pierre doesn't have an online check-in, so I just asked for a window seat on the right side of the plane and got seat 1D. I went through security, passed through customs again, and found myself in this decently sized waiting area. Through the unfortunately smudged windows was the very same ATR getting pulled out of the hangar and onto the ramp. Soon enough, it was unfortunately time to board and leave this wonderfully unique place behind. Let's go to Halifax. I settled in the very front of the ATR with some extra knee room in the emergency exit row. Just like the flight here, we were starting up within minutes. Here's the departure from Saint Pierre off of runway 26. Saint Pierre to Halifax covers about 600 kilometers and is just over an hour and a half in the air. Here in the bulkhead row, the seat back pocket contents were the same, just with this extra safety note included. On this flight, Air Saint-Pierre offered a slightly wider selection of drinks, and I had this cup of orange juice. It makes me wonder if they offer any sort of snacks on their Montreal flights, since those can be over 3 hours long going westbound. Air Saint-Pierre's ATR 42600 seats 46 passengers in 11.5 rows. The single lavatory on this plane is actually pretty cleverly positioned, going into the rear of the plane rather than being along the aisle. That means a bit more space to move around, which is definitely appreciated, with the exception of headroom. Pretty soon, Cape Breton Island came into view, and this random French adventure was coming to a close. So, was it worth it to fly from St. John's to Halifax through France? Absolutely. When it comes to visiting Saint Pierre and Miquelon, the best way is probably a variation of what I did. Air Saint-Pierre's Montreal flights can be quite pricey, mostly because of the distance, and the flights from Halifax and St. John's are more affordable. This is definitely the sort of place where you should spend a few nights though, for the experience and to see everything Saint Pierre and Miquelon have to offer. From the history, to the food, to the delightfully random nature of visiting a genuine piece of France 20 kilometers from Canada, this was a trip to remember. Thank you so much for watching my adventure with Air Saint-Pierre, and I'll catch you next time.